Is it true? Men are still trapped alive inside the Arizona?
We can hear tapping from inside the hull. We're doing everything we can to get to them, but they're 40 feet below water.
We've been trained to think that we're invincible. And now our proudest ships has been destroyed by an enemy we considered inferior. We're on the ropes, gentlemen. That's exactly why we have to strike back now.
Japan had already started a gradual invasion of China before World War II, which caused both an open-door policy agreement in which the Japanese and the U.S. had agreed to allow free trade in Japan for the U.S. This opened up tariffs that both the U.S. and the League of Nations imposed and added to the resentment to the U.S. that the Japanese had already felt. The Japanese decided to attack the U.S. Pearl Harbor was the first offensive attack that the Japanese did against the U.S. forces in the Pacific.
We want to have it for a permanent record, what people are thinking.
I see. Well, yesterday afternoon, about 20 minutes to 2, right here over this, in front of the Gaiety Theater, we got the word over the radio that Japan took a shot at Hawaii. For myself, I was fit to be tied. If I was young, I'd be in an airplane tonight, making for that destination.
I'll be called into the draft pretty soon. I'm eligible. I'm in the 1A classification, and it hit me pretty bad.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces.
I'm 104 years old, and I'm the oldest living Pearl Harbor survivor. I was a naval reservist. I joined about 5 years before the war started. We assembled here in San Diego, and then from San Diego, they assigned us to a minesweeper, and then they sent us to Pearl Harbor. On the 6th of December, at night, we'd go on an operation, sleeping right outside the harbor. That morning, we spotted the submarine trying to get in the harbor, and we reported to the USS Ward, and then we thought it was the end of our duty. I went home and went to bed because I was so tired. I hadn't slept in all night, and I told my wife I didn't want to eat breakfast. I just wanted to get some sleep, which I did. And then after, I thought it was about 5-10 minutes of sleep, she came over into our bedroom and called me and told me that everything was on fire, that we were being attacked. I went out and saw the harbor on fire, and all black smoke from the oil, from the ships burning. And so it was dark, black dark, and I felt terrible to see all those ships on fire and the men struggling to keep alive in the oily water. Tears came to my eyes because of the destruction of the ships and more important, the lives that were lost. I never will forget it.
U.S. entered World War II the day after Pearl Harbor, December 8, 1941. Due to the agreement of Europe First by the Allies, the Pacific Theater wasn't a priority until the surrendering of Germany in the European Theater. Douglas MacArthur was appointed as the commander of the United States Pacific Naval Fleet. During the Pacific Arena, Douglas MacArthur used strategies of island hopping. This included islands like Iwo Jima and taking them out in a straight path as possible, allowing B-29 bombers to get within range of Japan. Shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan attacked the Philippines because it granted them key positions in their quest to conquer. Japanese soldiers quickly overcame the U.S. and Filipino defenders and pushed them back until MacArthur was forced to execute a planned withdrawal to the jungle redoubt of the Bataan Peninsula. The Japanese underestimated the amount of prisoners after the Battle of Bataan, so they marched with 76,000 captured Allied soldiers across the Bataan Peninsula to San Fernando, which is about 80 miles. This forced march became known as the Bataan Death March, but soldiers were starved, bayoneted, shot, and beat due to the high numbers of prisoners. In the end, 10,000 men died during the march, and the 66,000 survivors would spend 40 months in horrible confinement camps. This ultimately caused the U.S. to focus on the Japanese expansion, as it was deemed a real threat.
Of course, the first thing they did was they stole everything we had. They took our wallets, they took our anybody that had a ring, they took our ring, they took our dog tags, and they emptied our musette bags on the ground and picked out whatever they wanted. And then once they had taken everything that we had, and as we kept going through these frontline Japanese troops, that's when they began to beat us. They beat us with rifle butts, they beat us with sabers, they beat us with clubs and anything they could get their hands on. And anybody that had a helmet, steel helmet on their heads, they knocked it off with the rifle butt. And that went on all day long.
The Japanese had a very honorable system of code which they followed strictly, including their ideology of dying rather than surrendering. The Japanese kamikaze pilots deliberately flew their planes into ships and other enemy things. This ideology had rarely been fought against the United States forces. This placed fear into the American forces. The kamikaze pilots showed the endurance of the Japanese military. However, this revealed that the Japanese was becoming more desperate and weaker with every plane that they lost. The Battle of Coral Sea was a Japanese offensive in the southwest Pacific just off the coast of Australia. It lasted 4 days, from May 4th to May 8th. Japanese forces were trying to get a foothold on Australian and South American aid ships. U.S. codebreakers had figured out Japanese codes were learning about the attack that would directly come from Port Moresby, New Guinea.
What the Japanese were trying to do was to control the waters around Australia and prevent Australia being supplied from America. The Allied forces had much better signals intelligence, and they were able to intercept Japanese communications and predict that they were going to attack Port Moresby, and that allowed them to preposition their forces into the Coral Sea to intercept the Japanese invasion fleet. The Americans were able to deploy 2 aircraft carrier groups based on the Lexington and the Yorktown.
The Battle of Midway was a major turning point in the Pacific theater. It took place June 4th through 7th and was around the Pacific island of Midway. It was a major U.S. victory in the Pacific, and it was the last Japanese offensive measure. The U.S. codebreakers had heard of the plans to attack the U.S. at Midway. The U.S. sent the entire Pacific fleet to hide on the western side of the island and wait for Japanese to start their assault and then fire back. Iwo Jima was a heavily fortified island located about 800 miles from the Japanese mainland. Its close proximity to Japan made it the perfect place for landing the planes, and docking ships made it a vital island for invasions, which meant it was heavily defended. This caused the invasion of Iwo Jima to last about 5 weeks. U.S. Marines invaded Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945. After months of naval air bombardments, approximately 70,000 U.S. Marines and 18,000 Japanese soldiers took part in the battle. Marines captured 216 Japanese soldiers, and the rest were killed in action. The island was finally declared secure on March 16, 1945.
We were off the island the night before, and at daybreak, we stand out on a port quarterdeck watching the bombing of the island itself. The Navy was doing all the bombing. At daybreak, got light enough, we could see the bombs as they released them. The dive bombers released them, you know. And it's a miracle anything stood on that island, but then they were pretty well dug in.
The Battle of Okinawa happened on Easter Sunday, April 1st, and lasted until June 22nd. Over 100,000 casualties for the Japanese and over 50,000 for the Allies. Okinawa is an island and is described as a typhoon of steel.
They had heard of Normandy, Saipan, and Iwo Jima, where the enemy had mowed down Americans by the thousands as they came ashore. Their briefing was matter-of-fact and frightening. Expect dug-in defenses on the hills above the beaches. expect a storm of repelling firepower. Expect an 80% casualty rate. Americans have limited intelligence going in. Aerial reconnaissance is lacking. Maps are inaccurate. They can only guess at what lies ahead.
Navajo code talkers were Marines in World War II who were also members of the Navajo tribe of Native Americans. There were 29 original code talkers who spoke in a language that was unwritten and unknown to the Japanese, so their code was unbreakable. In the Battle of Iwo Jima alone, the Navajo code talkers were able to successfully transmit over 800 coded messages.
I served during World War II as a Navajo code talker with the United States Marine Corps. I served there for a little over 2 years, stymieing the Japanese with our language that we had developed a code from that ancient language.
Because of the secrets the code talkers had to transmit, they were the first to hit the beach and the last to leave.
So when we got in the military, we had to talk about submarines and bombers and battleships and all these types of things for a reconnaissance plane. Well, it flies at night, it is quiet, doesn't carry any armament, and we said, well, that's a hummingbird. So in Navajo, it was Daki-tien, and that's hummingbird in the Navajo language.
75 years, the end of World War II, we should take time to appreciate all the veterans did for our freedom, as well as stopping a world war. The end of the Pacific Theater by many is when the U.S. dropped the atomic bombs on Japan. The Pacific Theater was a bloody campaign where thousands of people lost their lives.
With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.